Sumitro's birthday is around the corner, and I have been asked to say a few things about growing up around him and how I remember him, and I'm very grateful for that. So it starts like this. 5 days before the school final exam, physics, chemistry, geography, and all the other mighty disciplines were nibbling away at my sanity. Books were piling up, and anxiety had become a permanent member of the household. Everything was plastered in a thick, sticky seriousness. This examination, this madhumik, will determine my future, my fate. That was the general discussion around everywhere. 5 days before the school final exam, Sumitro called me up, and his voice jumped up and down in joy. Have you heard it yet? It's incredible. It's life-changing. You need to go to YouTube and look up Tunirma now. Growing up in Shantiniketan and growing up within a sort of aesthetic hegemony, cultural hegemony, I did not have a lot of people in my life who would be excited, let alone even be interested to watch or listen to something like Tunirma, which is an incredibly popular Bangla song, and it's clearly from not an upper middle class but a lower class culture. And Sumitra was that one sort of breath of fresh air in my life who instilled this love for the popular, or at least an interest and admiration for a culture that that is not necessarily something I've grown up around. And he had an eye for that, and he had a heart for that, because he went to these things without, not from a position of judgment, not from a position of hierarchy, not to just use that for his own work, but to be able to understand what's happening. And at the same time, he was not somebody who was romanticizing these things. He had a very strong interest in understanding how gender worked in things, and that's something I'll briefly talk about later. So he was the only person who could do this, who could call me up just before my madhyamik exam and say that what you're doing right now, reading about all the high arts and literature and linear events in history, it's important, but this is also important. It's happening right now, and you need to see this. It has taken me years to understand what it means to be interested in popular culture. It is not unusual for artists to engage with contemporary popular media. And much later on, I went on to read a little bit of visual studies and visual culture, and had to read one of the great patriarchs of Western art history, Clement Greenberg, who had this famous thesis of the kitsch, who had said that, true enough, simultaneously with the entrance of the avant-garde, a second new cultural phenomenon appeared in the industrial West. That thing to which the Germans give the wonderful name of kitsch, popular commercial art and literature, with their chromotypes, magazine covers, illustrations, ads, slick and pulp fiction, comics, Tin Pan Alley music, tap dancing, Hollywood movies, etc., etc. Sumitra was my confidant and fellow traveler into the world of all things kitsch. He was the person to talk to after having found a new comic book, after seeing an iconic advertisement, and after having an earworm of a jingle. Some of Sumitra's celebrated works, such as the ones from the Faxnama series, bear witness to his own gaze towards the Bengali middle-class popular aesthetics. That's what I've written, and at the same time, Sumitra did not see these things as kitsch. That's my precise point, that that for him this was such an important part of his own life. When he did the Faxnama series, I remember I was a kid. I got very excited to recognize the typography, the typeset that he used. He painted that for the name Faxnama, which was a parody of the underwear brand Lux Cozy. And that was immediate, that connection, because those advertisements were everywhere. And I don't think I've ever had a conversation with him about sexualities and masculinity and femininity explicitly. But I remember him talking about these things, not like a very clear, spelled out, decisive way, but through metaphors, but through his interest in saying, what does it mean to advertise for men's underwear? How is the man presented? He was bothered about these things. He was interested about these things. He was interested in how masculinity was advertised, marketed, and sold. And I think sort of these works from the series are a result of that, amongst many other things. I was perhaps 12 years of age at the time, and unaware of Clement Greenberg's disapproval of popular culture. I did have a dangerous proximity to an institutionalized and hegemonic Shantiniketan aesthetic. Kitsch seemed incredibly liberating in that atmosphere. I do not think that Sumitra Das' approach to the Bengali popular was the same. Like I said, it wasn't like he was thinking of dealing with these things as kitsch. We, however, had bonded over critically looking at hegemonic Bengali upper-class caste aesthetics. For example, he would talk a lot about the decorations of Bengali weddings, of the kind of sculpture of women pouring water from a earthen pot or blowing the conch and so forth. He had an interest about the way pandals were decked out during Pujo, and we would talk about those things. We would talk about recent trends in public gatherings, in mass-scale decorations for celebrations, changing celebrations, and so forth. There are three things that stand out in the way my memory of Sumitra has been preserved. The first is his interest to look at things which are far beyond high art, which is something I've mentioned, or even art. Sumitra was interested in visuals. That's something that I came to appreciate quite late, when I realized that there is this huge distinction between visuals and what gets accepted and promoted as art in a given society. And Sumitra was interested in art very much, but he was just interested in pictorial media. He was interested in popular pop-up Valentine's Day cards of the year. We have actually sat together and talked about how those cards are built, what they represent, what kind of aesthetics they have, as well as the posters for Chatra around Bardhaman. This was around the time when my mother was traveling to Bardhaman 5 days a week for work, and it created these conversations around middle class, upper caste families, and how that informs the topography of these places. Between Ma and Sumitra, they would talk so much about customs and practices and gender roles in these families, and how that got translated into the general landscape atmosphere of these places. The second is his engagement with caste, something that I'm reminded of in his depiction of the Bengali middle class. Sumitra spoke a lot about caste, not in a way that that it would be the obvious topic of the discussion, but he was incredibly, I think, anxious to understand his own caste identity and those around him. So it inevitably became something that he would talk a lot about, and I'll discuss that in a while. The third is his critical interest in the figure of the not just male artist, in the figure of the artist. Shromona took quite a few of my pop-ups home, and I was honored beyond words for that. I've seldom had people sit with me and undo a pop-up fold to understand the mechanics. I was making little books, zines, at the time, and discovering this new term, graphic novels, that had been floating around in the Indian post-millennial publication world. Sumitro returned one winter evening in the next year, dressed in his signature full formal shirt, cuffed here with buttons, full solid knit sweater, and a brown muffler wrapped around his head. "I've made a book on Bera Lerbier," he exclaimed. We gathered around his large handmade book. It was this huge black and white handmade book, flipping through the pages of a satire on the upper class Bengali leisure. As far as I know, his pop-up books did not make it into the memory of the internet. I could not find any images anywhere. He made them perhaps for a private audience. Perhaps it was a language that he was still experimenting with. I remember Sumitro's large canvases, but I also remember his zines. The latter are less spoken of and less remembered. Bera Lerbier, I think, also came from, again, his family, his identity, his struggle of belonging to the north and the south of Kolkata. And it's also about, of course, the colonial nouveau riche, the Babu culture. And what was interesting for me in that book was that the cats had such a central role. It was a satire, and it was a very gendered satire, in the way that the female cat was passively getting married or being forced to get married. This whole idea was also about forced marriages, and at the same time about leisure and exploitation. And it's a shame that not a lot of people got to see that book. Sumitro was a keen observer. He took pride in his satirical, critical gaze. I remember this one series of paintings that he did where, again, flat colors and the shapes were that sort of similar to the cutouts that Binod Bihari had done. And it had this huge figure in the middle with, again, a pair of sunglasses on, which also seemed like there were cutouts in the same style. And I remember him just sitting there and saying, you get it, right? You get it, that Binodda was blind towards the end. And I am saying that after having seen what I've seen, I wish I hadn't. I wish I didn't have the sight to see these things. There was this incredible struggle in Sumitro about his surroundings, and very, very often he dealt with that through satire and parody. His engagement with the popular was informed by his critical mind as well as his tensions with his own class identity. He was deeply involved in understanding his own community, his caste. He belonged to the Aguri community from Bardhaman, and he used to talk about the sort of how the idea of non-Bengali militant masculinity is imbibed through that story of the caste heritage. I used to sit across from him and listen to the mesmerizing tales of the Aguri clan of Bardhaman. He used to talk about private property a lot. He used to talk about how gender is sort of how the gender difference is preserved in those families. He used to talk about what it means to be a woman in those conservative families that he is observed as a man. He always had an eye for understanding how power structures work in spaces like in institutions like families. Conversations around caste-based masculinity and family structure often take me back to those evenings. I cannot not see their reflections in his construct of the Bengali popular. There is a long history of feminist interventions that look into the personal and the domestic. There is also a long cultural history of associating these observations with the feminine, gossips about jewelry, about makeup, about ensemble and wedding gifts. And Sumitro, though, was full of quirky tales of them, always presenting them with a sprinkle of delightful bitterness. In many ways, Sumitro had this incredible interest in everything that we grow up understanding as male. He was interested, and he used to give alponas for pujos. He used to perform rituals, although he wasn't a Brahmin. He was really into understanding how the kind of ritualistic roles that are designated for women in upper caste Hindu families. I don't think I ever had a clear conversation with him about why and how he was interested in that, what it meant for him as a man to want to do these things and to do these things, to take up the role that's designated for an upper caste Hindu woman. What did it mean for him? Did it mean something about his own identity? I never got to have these conversations with him, but I remember him struggling with it because he would do it. He would give alpona. He was so interested in cooking. He would always ask me about recipes. He would make the perfect nadu. And then he would call up my mother and say, I've just done it. So it's not something that was obvious for him. It was a transgression. And at the same time, I never got to talk to him about what it meant for him. The struggle of going against the normative caste-based gendered expectations echoed as a satirical tone in his tales. He would always comment about how much gold did some family demand during the wedding, what did the women do, how they basically conned the other family by buying fake faux imitation jewelry. This sort of small tales of gender-based subversions in the family, the woman outsmarting the man, and so forth. These are things that I've always grown up hearing from him, and at the same time, it's not. He was aware that this is not a normative behavior for a man, perhaps, to take so much interest in feminine gossips in the family. Sumitro was the man who noticed designs of wedding jewelry and communal stereotypes. The man who spoke about the Metropolitan Museum of Art and also of actor Dev's latest Bengali films. The idea of an artist who's an intellectual to have the courage to say that there is this whole zone of culture that I do not necessarily understand very well, and to be willing to understand that is something that he had in him. He had one eye on the biennales of the world and on the latest installations, and the other on the shifting alleys of Bardhaman. Shifting because of the political changes that happened in between, how it affected the walls, how posters changed, how representation of gendered languages changed in them is something he would talk about. I've never met an artist so aware of the construct of the artist as a social category, constantly commenting on and struggling with the production of the contemporary artist. He would come back from a show and talk about how somebody dressed, how artists dress, artist as a separate social construct, somebody who's visibly different, excuse me, to the rest of the people. By this time, I must have read some English romanticism and Frank Kermode. I knew the male artist as a solitary creature and a social invention. Sumitra must have been a solitary creature in his own way, although he was surrounded and loved by incredible friends, trying to uncover the ever-shifting codes of what product the successful contemporary artist was. He's always been so charged, so passionate about that, calling up my mother or just sitting here, coming here and talking to us about the get-up, the costume of an artist that is noticed, the artist that matters. There was a lot of interest, there was a lot of zeal, passion, and a little bit of bitterness there, because he was always trying to tap into that performativity, to understand how to act like the successful artist, even amongst other artists. Perhaps that is why he kept changing his signature in each series of his paintings. "I changed my sign again," he had said once. "Seemed like the last one has become outdated." I remember how eager he was to not be outdated. He was engaged in a chess match with the public sphere, trying to stay actively relevant. His zeal to understand and outsmart contemporaneity was noteworthy, perhaps ever-growing as well. He was one of the most un-artsy-looking artists that I knew at the time, and even now. Not just in Kolkata, but even in Shantiniketan. He spent a significant amount of time of his life here, and he never got influenced by the Shantiniketan aesthetics of presenting oneself in a cultural sphere. He never dressed like he belonged here. He never dressed like he belonged to the code of this aesthetic. He always, for a long time, I wouldn't say always, the majority of the time that I've known him, he would always be seen in this sort of middle class, seemingly middle class, clerical outfit, if one may say so. A proper full shirt, a vest in early winter, a full sweater later on, and a brown muffler around his head. Never have I ever met an artist like that, who spent the winter wrapped in a brown muffler. It took me years to realize how conscious that ensemble was, how rooted it was in his seemingly middle-class self-portraiture. It took me years to realize that that's the role that he was trying to perform for a while as an artist. Sumitra has been gone many winters now. Many winters of wondering why he went the way he did. What hurt, what muffled, etc. He was a master satirist with a giggle tucked under his jaw, his mustache. I used to say that he resembled Sukumar Rai's drawings of the senile cat from Hojaborolo. I told him that, and he laughed exactly like that cat. He was sharp as a whip and eager to dissect the social nexus that produces the image of the contemporary artist. Ever observant, ever mocking, ever adding a little delightful bitterness to the mix. That's how I remember him. Like the great Cheshire cats, his large, satirical smile has stayed on, even after he's disappeared.